Does anybody want to tell me what book we're reading out of?
Habakkuk.
Habakkuk, 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 whatever you want to say. It's where we're at. So, let's have a confession time. When is the last time you've read the book of Habakkuk or Habakkuk? Last night, the day before?
Today.
Today?
You listen to me.
Well,
Same thing.
I was in the camp with a little bit longer, farther back, since I read this hefty 3-chapter book. But Amy asked me to study through it and do a study with you guys, and I am very happy that I did. But before we go forward, let's go back a little bit. Very little is actually known about Habakkuk. But what we do know is that his name means embracer. And this was likely written when Joachim was ruling Judah. This is pretty unique because this book captures a conversation between the prophet and God. And it starts off pretty high on the gloomy scale because Habakkuk had seen some very difficult days ahead. But it also ends with a tremendous amount of hope and expectation. So, as I went through this, I couldn't help but think about how similar this book is to what we see going on in the world around us today. Completely. And you could really say that this is a study of then and now, because these words apply not only to the time of Habakkuk, but also for today. So Habakkuk chapter 1, 1 through 4. Who wants to read? Be good and loud and clear, please.
The oracle which Habakkuk the prophet saw. How long, O Lord, will I call for help, and you will not hear me? I cry unto you violence, yet you do not save. Why do you make me see iniquity, and cause me to look on wickedness? Yet destruction and violence are before me, strife success, and contention arises.
So Habakkuk is a prophet with a very large problem. I guess you could say several problems, but not personal problems like we have, but really some questions that required answers from God. You see, Habakkuk was looking around the world that he lived in, and he saw unbelievable injustice, violence, and inequality that never seemed to be judged or punished. And this kind of irked Habakkuk pretty bad. Amy saw me reading my commentary the other night, and asked what book I was reading, and this is kind of one of the thoughts that I was taking away from that, because the book says, planet Earth may look marvelous from a satellite, but for those who live on the dusty globe, things tend to look rather grim. Increased turmoil, rising terrorism, mountain tragedies, unprecedented trauma, increasing pollution, deepening trials, and unparalleled tensions cast dark shadows over earthlings. The world looks more and more like an ominous black sphere with a very short fuse, a time bomb sizzling to explode. Is it little wonder thinking people began to ask questions? Why is there so much oppression? Why all the injustice? Why do evil men prosper? Why do the righteous suffer? Why doesn't God do something? Why doesn't God clean up this mess? Why? These penetrating questions are hardly new. Centuries before Christ visited this planet, an ancient prophet looked around at the violence and wickedness of the world and cried out to God, "Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrong? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves?" The prophet not only asked these mysterious whys that plague mankind, he also received answers to his questions. The answers given by the Creator of the universe are carefully recorded in a little book called Habakkuk or Habakkuk. So his first question is, how long, God? How long do I cry out without an answer? Why don't you do something? Now, isn't this a question that we ask from time to time? This is a question, if you go back in the Bible, that a lot of the stars or big names in the Bible have asked themselves. And if you just take a quick look, you can see King David in Psalm says, "How long, O Lord? Will you forget me for forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and every day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me?" And Job says, "Though I cry, I've been wronged. I get no response. Though I call for help, there is no justice." Jeremiah, who we know is the weeping prophet, he says, "Even when I call out or cry for help, he shuts out my prayer. He has barred my way with blocks of stones. He has made my paths crooked." And no doubt, this question of why and how long, why don't you do something, is things that we often find ourselves asking when we are having times of difficulty or uncertainty. And this is a common question that we as earthlings, human beings on this planet have. Do you know why? Because God doesn't work in our time. He works on His own timetable. You have to remember that God works to and for eternity. We need to always remember that. Things often seem to take a long time because God is allowing His purposes to be reached. You can see the book of Romans where it talks about this, where it says suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance produces character, and character hope. So if we want to have a godly character, then we have got to learn perseverance. And by learning perseverance, we have to learn what it is like to suffer. So these things take time, and it often finds us asking these same questions that Habakkuk does. Now, worldwide, this is a question that's still being asked right now, because if we sit and look, especially in today's times, what do we see going on? We see rioting, violence, and never mind the immorality that we see going on. And now we have that wonderful term of social injustice that is going on. We can even drop the word social from that and just look at the injustice that happens in this world. And that by itself would be enough for us to say, how much longer? How long before you decide to judge this world? This is the cry of the souls under the altar in the book of Revelation. So how long, sovereign Lord, holy and true to you, judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood? It is a common question that has been asked from the times past until now. So, let's kind of break that down just a little bit and look and see if we can figure out the source of this question. Because Habakkuk says, the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted. So according to Habakkuk, the source of this was that God's law was paralyzed in these days. So Habakkuk is probably writing a little bit after the time of King Josiah, and he was what was considered a good king in the southern kingdom of Judah. And after him was Jehoahaz, who was bad and did not last more than 3 months. And then Jehoiakim comes, and he is there for 11 years, and he is also very bad. And at this point in time, the kingdom really started to deteriorate and degrade, and the Mosaic law was really breaking down, and all these people were turning away from God. So here's the question: is God's law paralyzed in our judicial system today? Are we finding God's law taken away in our courts?
Being taken away?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like taken out?
Yeah. You can't say no, because what have we legalized?
Abortion.
Abortion. Daily.
Okay.
We murder thousands of babies a day. Thousands of babies. Anything else?
Gay marriage.
Homosexual marriage. I mean, it's one of the most unpopular things. We're living in a time of cancel culture. If you don't like what I say, I should shut up. That my thoughts and opinions are canceled. But these are things that God declared to be bad. And yet our judicial system now says they're okay. So what about what we see in our schools? What do we do whenever laws are passed that allow no more prayer in school? Or that you're no longer allowed to study your Bible in school? But yet, our kids can go to school and be forced to learn about Islam or the Quran and all these other religions, and they call it, we're learning about multicultural studies. We are moving so far away from Christian foundation that this country was founded on. And it is resulting in the exact same thing that Israel was seeing in these days as they were walking away from God. So, Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 5 through 11. Who wants to read?
Look among the nations and see, wonder and be astounded. For I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, who march through the brethren of the earth, to seize dwelling not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. Their horsemen come from afar, like fly. They fly like an eagle swift to devour. They all come for violence, all their faces forward. They gather captives like sand. At kings they scoff, and at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it. Then they sweep by like the wind. Then they swept by like the wind and go on, guilty men, whose own mighty is their God. Wait, whose own might is their God.
So here God answers, and this is totally not what Habakkuk was expecting. In fact, this is kind of like a blow you away kind of answer, because he's thinking that God has been strangely silent and kind of absent. But the truth of the matter was quite the opposite. God says, hey, look at the nations and watch. You're going to be amazed because of what I am going to do. You would not believe it, even if somebody told you. The truth was that God was already raising up the nation of Babylon. Was the Chaldeans to come against Judah, and this was a little bit of a bombshell to him, because Habakkuk knew the Babylonians. No doubt he had heard the stories. We talked about it when we studied through Daniel. These people were ruthless, and they were a fierce bunch of warriors. And remember, they blew through place after place, taking over and annihilating, and they were super fast for vengeance and violence. Now you think about this, because sin no doubt was abounding in Judah at this time. But even whenever you compare the worst sin that was probably going on in Judah, these guys were still just slightly dirty saints compared to the Babylonians. You look, God actually affirms these thoughts about the Babylonians whenever Habakkuk calls them ruthless and impetuous people. Ruthless there is a word that we're kind of familiar with in the original. It's called mar. Remember that? Remember she said, my name is Mara?
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean?
Yeah.
Bitter. bitter in temper, fierce, impetuous. Here means swift. Ezekiel calls them, the Babylonians, a ruthless nation, which he used a slightly different word that actually kind of means terror striking numerous times in his book. And their conduct really matched their character, because they just swept across the earth, plundering and possessing things as they went. Of course, the whole earth, we're talking at the time, is what they would have known would be Assyria, Judah, Egypt, and probably Edom. So Judah was just like a little speck of dust, and Babylon would have been this giant vacuum cleaner. So what really is puzzling Habakkuk here is that God was going to use them at all. The Babylonians, out of all the people of the earth, how could he use such a godless, heathen nation? Why would he do that? God would use these Babylonians, as he has often used all these other wicked nations, to accomplish exactly what he wanted to accomplish. But that did not mean that the Babylonians would not reap what they had sown as well. They were still very much responsible for their actions. At the end of verse 11, it says, "But they will be held guilty, they whose strength is their God." And also in Jeremiah, the Lord says, "I will send Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant, and will bring them against this land and against its inhabitants, and against all these nations round about, and I will utterly destroy them. Then it will be, when 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, declares the Lord, for their iniquity, to the land of the Chaldeans, and I will make it an everlasting desolation." Of course, we know when we read through the book of Daniel that King Nebuchadnezzar was judged severely. But what was the real beautiful thing about Nebuchadnezzar?
Turning back to God.
He went through the years as a beast, but through those years he learned to trust and praise God. And I hope that that is the result of some of these nations whenever God finally does judge them in the last days. So before we look at how Habakkuk responds, let's take a look and see how these things relate to us today. Now, God's work back then to Habakkuk would have been unthought of. But we know that in the last days, God is going to do something way more radical. Daniel he said that the last days would lead to a time of distress that has not happened from the beginning of the nations until then. And Jesus even talks about this. He kind of echoes what Daniel said, because in Matthew he says there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. And Luke, it talks about how men's heart will fail from fear and from the expectation of these things that are coming on the earth. I don't think that these times are quite here yet, but I think we should see some storm clouds coming just over the hills. So Habakkuk is told to look at the nations and watch. And we should be able to look at what's going around not only in our country, but in the world, and see God's hand as all these upheavals are occurring everywhere. So we should keep watch and be alert. What did that cornerstone fella say? Be ready.
Remember, brace yourself.
Brace yourself. Brace yourself. Because Habakkuk here, he didn't think anything was going on. But whenever the invasion and the destruction of Judah came, it was swift and it was unexpected by most people. So here Habakkuk responds. In Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 12 through 17, who wants to read?
Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O Rock, have established them for reproof. You who are of purer eyes than to see evil, and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly look at these traitors, and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? You make mankind like the fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler. He brings all of them up with a hook. He drags them out with his net. He gathers them in his dragnet. So he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and makes offerings to his dragnet. For by them he lives in luxury, and his food is rich. Is he then to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever?
So if Habakkuk thought he had a problem earlier, when he thought God wasn't doing anything, after God speaks, he has got a really big problem now. Because as he thinks about not only what Babylon has done to other nations, he starts comparing them to a big net that catches and drags away all men without mercy. And this is who God is going to use. So he keeps thinking on this and he struggles. And he has two main problems. One is, how could a God who is pure and holy use somebody that is so wicked? And how could God judge Judah using this nation who is far more wicked than Judah was? J. Martin McGee actually wrote something on this that I thought was pretty good, but it should also be kept in your mind that this was written in 1981. So I would dare say that most people who remember those days would look back on those days as the good old days. But the time has passed since then, has not been kind for us Christians in this country. This is what he wrote. This may be a new thought for you. You probably have heard it said, even from some pulpits, that God would never let Russia overcome the United States because we are the fair-haired boys, the good guys, the fine people. We're the ones who send missionaries to godless nations. God would never use Russia to chastise us. My friend, if you believe the Bible, you will see that God's method is to use a sinful nation to judge a people who are less sinful. If we could see what God is doing today behind the scenes, I am sure it would terrify us. I believe He is actually moving against our nation. Why? Because at one time our nation had a knowledge of God, superficial though it may have been. The Bible was once held in reverence. Very few people knew much about it, but it was respected. In our day, the Bible is ignored and absolutely rejected by the nation. They may take an oath by placing their hand upon it, but they neither know nor care to know what is between its covers. Will God allow our nation to continue in its godlessness and in its flagrant sins? I don't think so. Will God use a godless nation to chastise us? Well, that was Habakkuk's question. Why would God, who is a holy God, use a pagan, heathen people to chastise His people? So, going with this thought, Habakkuk's questions would be like somebody in this country crying out to God, and God saying, hey, I've seen how these things are going on in the country, and what I am going to do is raise up Islam against my people. And that is not what we would want to hear, but that is exactly how things work in the Bible. So here Habakkuk is still trying to process what God has said, and he reminds God of these promises that He has made to Israel, even though he knows that Judah requires correction. And thank God that He is always faithful to His promises. Because He promises that even though when judgment comes, He will give mercy to His people. So this whole chapter starts with this prophet wanting to know why God isn't doing anything. And then when God tells him that what He's doing, he's shocked. So I guess sometimes you just can't please everybody. But even this question that comes is going to be answered in chapter 2. And God outlines clearly in chapter 2 why this judgment is coming. And if we really wanted to be particular, we would say that this chapter could have actually been wrote about a month ago. Could have been about a month ago. Because this chapter will also give us hope. Because it talks about how the righteous must live by faith. And that one day, the entire earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of God.